Good afternoon, everybody. I am Sam Sifton, an assistant managing editor of The Times and the founding editor of NYT Cooking. I'm here today with three of my colleagues, our chief restaurant critic, Pete Wells, our California restaurant critic, Tejal Rao, who's based in Los Angeles, and Besha Rodell, our Australian food critic, or restaurant critic, I should say, who's based in Melbourne. You will likely have read many of their bylines in recent weeks and years, and you'll note that you've likely never seen their faces. We plan to keep it that way. Today's event is part of a slate of virtual events that the Times is producing to help readers understand and navigate the world in which we find ourselves. And today, we will discuss the coronavirus's impact on the restaurant industry here in the United States and in Australia. And you'll get a chance to ask questions about what we're hearing, seeing, learning, reporting, and writing here at the Times. So a quick housekeeping note before we begin on that front. You may submit questions at any time during this event using the Q&A feature in Zoom. And please note, once again, this event is being recorded. Pete, Besha, Tejal, you all with me?
Yeah.
Sure.
Hello.
Hello. I think we have some serious subject matter to talk about today, but what I'd like to do is begin with just how we're beginning most meetings here at the Times these days, with just a quick check-in. And let me ask you each how you're doing and where you are right now as we talk. Why don't we begin with you, Tejal?
I am at a very small desk in my bedroom in Los Angeles, in the neighborhood of Cypress Park. My dog is sitting right next to me, staring at me. And I have a roast chicken carcass from last night bubbling on the stove to make soup with later on today.
Oh, sounds terrific. Pete, how about you?
I'm in my bedroom too, in Brooklyn, and I'm, doing fine actually. Now that we've been home for what? How long have we been home now? 3.5 weeks?
6 years.
Yeah. I don't have the kind of night panics that I was having the first few weeks, where every time there was a draft through one of the windows in my house, I thought I was getting chills, and every time I drank a cup of coffee, I thought I was breaking out in a fever sweat. That's kind of ended, and now we've settled into just general gloom and doom.
Yeah, the time of, is it a panic attack or the coronavirus, is fading a little bit.
Yeah.
Besha, how about you? Where are you?
I am in the spare bedroom in my house in Melbourne, and it is 6 a.m. here, but like I kind of alluded to before, I've lost track of time. There is no time. I'm up at all hours because the world news, happens when I'm asleep. So I'm often awake at 3 a.m. and I'm fine. I'm just, slovenly and but enjoying doing a lot more cooking than usual.
Very good. Well, for the record, let the record show that I'm in my bedroom in Greenport, New York, on the North Fork of Long Island, and the wind is howling outside. So much so that I think there's a 30% chance that a tree will crash through a window right next to me and end this interview a little early. So let's hope that doesn't happen. It's only a 30% chance, and that's only in my coronavirus freaked out mind. Thank you for that update from all of you. I'm curious, Besha mentioned this, it must be odd not eating out every day and night. And Pete, in your case, for years and years now, 2-3 meals a day out in the restaurant world, what has it been like getting to know that strange room in your home called a kitchen again?
Yeah, boy, it is so, almost, I'm not sure I've ever lived like this, because before I was the restaurant critic, I was the editor of the food section, and I used to stay until whatever, 7:30, 8 o'clock, and then come home and either order something or make the fastest meal I could imagine. And then I went into this, this other job where I was going out every night. And so I don't really think I've had the experience of like cooking as an adult, maybe ever, at least in 20 years or so. It's wild.
How about you, Tejal?
I have worked as a cook for years before I started writing, and I love cooking. So it's painful to not go to restaurants. I miss them. I'm worried about them. But I get obsessive when I'm cooking at home. So I try to use up every single thing I have, especially right now because I'm trying to limit going out to grocery stores. So this chicken, I'll probably stretch it into, 2 or 3 meals. This tiny 2-pound chicken that I got. I'm really comfortable cooking a lot. I want to say I'm enjoying it, but I don't know if that's like a little bit of an exaggeration.
Yeah, it's okay to feel joy at this time.
Yeah, you're right.
We have to capture it where we can. And Besha, same question to you before we turn to the darkness.
Yeah, it's very weird, especially I was on the road when all of this hit. I was in South America and not only at a different restaurant a few times a day, but in a different country pretty much every day. And then to go from that, I came through the US, was in New York for a night or two, and then came directly home to Australia and had to go into mandatory quarantine for 14 days. So was not allowed to even leave my house to go for a walk or anything. And the difference between those two things was just really bizarre and kind of, I'm not sure my head is still spinning. And I miss restaurants so much. I mean, I love cooking and I'm, lucky in the last couple of years to have been able to, I file one column a month. So I get to be at home more often than my colleagues here. But that, the cooking and the washing up and the cooking and the washing up, the lovely thing about restaurants for those of us who, go to them a lot is that it's that time when you can just say, I don't feel like that. I want to go out and have somebody look after me. And I really, really miss that. Just the letting go of responsibility for a minute is such a luxury that I really miss.
I think you probably speak for us all, Besha. There is something that's remarkable about the experience. It seems all the more remarkable today about the experience of going into a restaurant and putting all of your trust in the hands of the crew that is serving you. Which brings us to the dark subject of this conference call today. The Times has reported that it could be that as many as 70%, maybe even higher, higher percentage than that, 70% of all independent restaurants, that is to say the sorts of restaurants that you three traffic in, could close because of the pandemic lockdown and the inability to keep a business going throughout it. I'd like to start, because we have a national, international audience here, by asking you to give us your best picture of the restaurant world that you inhabit. In Pete's case in New York, in Tejal's case in the state of California, and Besha in the nation of Australia, from where you sit in your lockdown. Pete, I'll start with you.
You mean what it looks like now?
Yes.
I mean, I I have very limited insight into that because I haven't left the house really. But
you've done an
from what I gather, yes,
yeah.
From what people tell me, right. So first of all, we have some fractional number of all restaurants in New York open in a very different role right now, where their dining rooms are dark, but their kitchens are are open and they are cooking either for pickup or for delivery. And there are restaurants that they've never done pickup or delivery before that are now clinging to it as the only way to keep a little money coming in and avert what would be financial disaster for the owners and in many cases for the employees as well. And then everybody else is dark behind shutters. And the employees are at home. The owners are biting their fingernails, just running different scenarios in their heads. What if we open the second week of May? What if we open the last week of May? What would that look like? What if the loan from the Small Business Administration doesn't come through until the beginning of June? And then the people who cook and bring us the food in the restaurants, most of them haven't seen a paycheck in a month now, and they are trying not to freak out, and in some cases just trying to figure out where their next meal is coming from.
Tejal, I imagine that the scene is somewhat similar in Los Angeles where you are. You have wrestled in print with the question of, what your relationship is to those restaurants that remain open in a strange sort of way, providing curbside pickup or delivery. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I wrote about it, and I still have really complicated feelings about it, but I've sort of landed on the side of supporting local independent restaurants that remain open. Like, as long as they remain open, I will keep, placing orders and doing no contact pickups or deliveries, whatever it is they're offering. But I'm so, at this point, we know that restaurant workers and workers all along the food supply chain, from fruit pickers and poultry plant cutters to grocery store workers and cooks, all these workers who are considered essential are getting their jobs done in extraordinarily dangerous work conditions, and they're keeping things running while we all stay safe at home. And I am uncomfortable with that. Restaurant workers don't have easy access to testing. They don't have guaranteed sick days. They don't have healthcare in some cases. A lot of them are being asked to choose right now between their health and safety and their wages. And when you're living paycheck to paycheck, which is how a lot of restaurant workers do live, that's an agonizing and impossible choice. And I wish restaurants could all just close safely and we could all know that they'd be able to reopen when this is over, but they can't. So my biggest concern right now is that we're telling restaurant workers are essential, but we're not really getting them what they need to work safely.
Besha, in Melbourne, where you are, can you give us a picture of what the restaurant lockdown looks like?
Sure, it's very similar. In Victoria, we are in what we're calling stage 3 lockdown, which means that you are not allowed to leave your house except under a very few set of circumstances. And there are actually police out on the street. It's very weird, kind of questioning people. You're not allowed to be in groups of more than 2 people. But we do still have restaurants that are operating for delivery and pickup. And, it's been easier for some restaurants to pivot to that. And some of those restaurants are very busy. I'd also say that in Australia, we don't have quite the same anxieties outside of the normal, is this thing going to kill me anxiety of working, because there's universal healthcare here. We have the virus much more under control in terms of the population than the US does. You can get tested if you need to get tested, and our hospitals aren't overwhelmed, and nobody is going to not go to the hospital because they're afraid they can't pay for it. That just isn't something that we have here. So it makes it a far less kind of morally fraught thing, I think, to continue to support these places. And people who are considered essential workers, for the most part, there are gaps, but they are getting, you know, pay kind of commensurate with that. The biggest thing here is really that a lot of people are relying on apps like Uber Eats and Deliveroo, who charge, you know, 35% often. And that, you know, there's been a lot of discussion here about the predatory nature of that, if it's predatory or helpful. So, you know, some of the places that were struggling to break even, you know, under normal circumstances now are questioning whether it's worth staying open. And many places have pivoted to become kind of mini grocery stores too, which is really interesting. But a lot of places can't. So I would say we've got about 80% of our restaurants just closed.
Let's talk about that pivot to grocery, or that pivot to a different business model. Pete, have you seen some creative business maneuvers in your, not seen, but have you found some in your reporting?
Well, yeah, I mean, all kinds of people are trying to pivot. I mean, the main problem is well, one of the main problems right now is that in New York City, on a normal day, say up until a month ago, 40% of the food that came into the city went to a restaurant. And so, you know, now that food almost without exception can't go into the restaurants, right? So it's either not being eaten, which is a problem, or it's got to find some other way into people's mouths, right? So all these distribution channels have to be kind of, you know, call in the plumber and change the pipes and move them off in different directions. So you've got wholesalers who've been selling to restaurants all their lives. Yeah, give me 40 pounds of swordfish and a couple hundred scallops for tonight. Now they're selling, you know, 6 scallops and 1 swordfish steak to some idiot in Brooklyn who doesn't know the difference between, you know, a 12 count clam and a 30 count clam, right? They're set up to sell in bulk. They're set up to sell to a limited number of customers who they deal with all the time, and now they're having to sell to you know, retail consumer. The only advantage of the retail consumer is that we're actually used to having to pay for things when we get them, so they don't have to wait to be paid if they're selling to us. But you know, in every other way, it's got to be driving them insane. Nobody's complained about this to me, but it's just it's got to be nuts when your business all revolves around a certain way of doing things, and it doesn't work anymore. And yes, stores, restaurants functioning as liquor stores and wine stores, restaurants functioning as cocktail bars with to-go windows, which is something I never thought I'd see in New York, and probably the only thing that I hope we can hold on to after this is over.
All of that's happening in LA too. All of those same things, and then additionally, the farmers and suppliers that were bringing those foods to the restaurant are now selling boxes directly to people, so they can, you know, pay $30 for a box of one particular farmer's mixed greens and vegetables or something like that, so that some of it's getting sold at least.
So we've talked about the restaurateurs and the and the customers, and the relationship between those two changing as different business models are explored. It seems to me perhaps we could turn next to two groups of people who are extraordinarily important to the future of independent restaurants: the landlords and the investors. The landlords, you know, they want their rent, but there's no money coming in to pay the rent. The investors want a return, but there's no money coming in on the return. From the discussions that you three have had with restaurateurs and other members of the restaurant ecosystem, how do you think these groups should respond? That is to say, landlords and investors. And I'll turn to you, Besha, first.
Yeah, here that's the hugest thing, as I think is everywhere. The Australian government has put in a 6-month moratorium on evictions, but it's very unclear what that means. And to most of the restaurateurs I've spoken to, their landlords are saying, well, you can pay half rent now, but you have to pay it back as soon as you open the door. It's hard to give a blanket statement to what they should do because different landlords are in different situations. I think it would be incredibly short-sighted for them to just be kicking people out, but I'm seeing a lot of that threatened. And I think that there's going to be a whole lot of really cheap leases when this thing reopens. And my worry is that it's just going to be big restaurant groups, chains that can afford to come in. I mean, as usual, it's the most vulnerable people here, especially, you know, people on migrant visas and stuff like that. But the mom and pop restaurants that don't have a well of money that are going to disappear. I think restaurants that have investors with deep pockets are going to be okay.
Tejal, what is that relationship of landlord, investor, restaurateur look like in Los Angeles?
I mean, again, it's different for different neighborhoods and different kinds of restaurants. But I'm thinking about that story that the Times reported a week ago, maybe around a week ago, about that landlord in Brooklyn, Mario Salerno, who just decided to cancel rent for hundreds and hundreds of tenants. Maybe there's a world in which that is possible for some of the restaurants. I don't know, but why not?
Yeah, why not? Well, so I'm going to turn to, we're getting some very good questions coming in from our listeners, and I'd like to pass along to you some of those questions as our discussion continues. Here's someone who is looking beyond the pandemic lockdown and toward a return to some sense of normalcy, to ask that if restaurants are subject to strict social distancing requirements when they reopen, how do you think they can make the economics work if the number of tables in the restaurant is reduced? Pete, do you want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, well, I don't know how to answer that, but I can talk around it for a minute. I mean, you'd also have to presumably have some social distancing in the kitchen as well. And, you know, if think about what the average restaurant kitchen looks like, you know, maybe you can have 2 people in there 6 feet apart. Maybe if nobody moves, you know, some of the, you know, bigger, more luxurious kitchens, you know, sort of laid out like basketball courts to begin with, and they might be able to get by. But boy, especially in any kind of like sort of concentrated urban area or downtown areas or all of New York City, kitchens are just like, you know, laid into like little spaces the size of a rug, you know.
What might that do to menus?
Well, I think you'd expect shorter menu. If this is really the science fiction scenario that we're going to be living with, fewer people in the dining room, very limited staff in the kitchen, limited front of house staff as well. You're going to be looking at very short menus and probably, you know, in the more ambitious restaurants without a lot of the bells and whistles that used to go out on the plate, you know, because there just won't be, you know, the staff there to create that little, you know, zucchini flower.
Right. Tejal, do you reckon the same for Los Angeles?
Yeah, I think so. I also imagine that, you know, takeout and delivery is not going to, it's going to continue to be a really big part of our lives for a long time. So maybe those menus will also be kind of suited to takeout.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Besha, I'll put it to you as well.
Yeah, I think that, you know, I was in New York when they were doing the you have to reduce by 50% thing. And I was actually supposed to eat at Le Bernardin that night and they closed. And I ended up at Aldila in Brooklyn instead. And it was funny because I was positive that at Le Bernardin I would have been further apart in their normal seating arrangement than I was at Aldila at 50% apart. So I think that, you know, the idea of putting these blanket instructions on every restaurant just is ludicrous.
Mm-hmm.
The different ones operate in such different ways. But I don't know that there's going to be a way to just say this one rule will work for every single restaurant. And I think it's, I mean, I feel like it's maybe a little wishful thinking to think that we can go back to going out if we just do X. It may be, you know, far more complicated than that.
I'd like to ask you to jump in a time machine and move to the future, to a time when the coronavirus is not an active threat, to a time when we've returned to some sense of real normalcy, that we're going out to restaurants again. Are there any possibly positive repercussions from what we've learned or are learning during this lockdown? Do you think that the rights of restaurant workers could possibly change as a result of what we've learned here? Tejal?
I mean, God, I hope so. If something good comes out of this, yeah, I hope that it's, as everyone is rebuilding the restaurant industry, that they're rebuilding it with restaurant workers in mind, so that if there's ever a disaster again, everyone is properly equipped to withstand it, you know, and everything doesn't collapse within a couple of weeks. I also, another positive thing, at least that I'm seeing in Los Angeles, is that a lot of people are relying more on local food, locally grown food and locally produced dairy and eggs and meat. And that's, you know, it's unfortunate that it's happening because of something terrible, but that does seem to be a good thing.
Well, I'm going to ask you to follow up on that. I know that you spent some time reporting at the farmers markets in Los Angeles. Was there increased interest in that local food? Was it not just better but safer in the eyes of the consumer?
I think at the very beginning, well, there was also a little bit of confusion because some of the markets remained open and then they were shut down because people weren't being very good at socially distancing, and then they reopened. But farmers markets have been much more reliable for produce and for other kinds of ingredients than supermarkets. And then it's also a much shorter supply chain. So people, I think, trust it more. And I'm not sure if the numbers, like off the top of my head, but there's definitely, there's an increased demand for local food. And that's also, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, do you have any good advice? One of our listeners, Isaac, wants to know how to best go about finding local food. It's a great pleasure to live in Los Angeles and New York and Melbourne, but if you live in the suburbs and it's a little more difficult, are there general practices that you can offer, any of you, for locating what we used to call farm-to-table food?
Yeah, I mean, even, it's definitely not, it's not a Los Angeles luxury to get to know what farms are around you. Like even in the suburbs, there are definitely farms around. I think it's just a matter of Googling and finding one that is either doing pickups of boxes of food or taking online orders. And I'm sure that a lot of those farms that were previously supplying restaurants are also looking for people. So it's just kind of like closing that loop.
How delightful it is to hear the chirping of birds in California in the background of your call, Tejal. It's a delight. Thank you for that. Here's a question. I'll start with you, Pete, about from a listener who's interested in knowing how you as critics view your role and your responsibility now and going forward. In other words, we're not reviewing restaurants. So what's your job right now, Pete?
Well, my job for the past month has been to try to, find out what's going on out there and then tell people about it. So reporting, just because I don't have any idea of very often, and I'm actually curious because I live in this restaurant world. So I just, I've been calling owners, I've been calling employees, I've been calling their lawyers and their bookkeepers and asking them, what's going on? What are you guys doing? And then trying to present it to people, because I think the reality of it is hard to imagine. If you're used to, every time you go to the local pizza place, the pizza guy is there, and then one day he's not. Like, well, where'd he go? What's he doing? How's he getting by? Is he eating pizza? Is he eating anything? So it's a great, gift to be able to call and say, hi, I'm calling from the New York Times. Would you talk to me for a little while? And it's a great gift for me too, as a restaurant critic, because I usually, when I call, I just sort of picture, people who think that, they're about to get a death sentence or something,
Klaxons going off.
So it's good to be able to call and say, hey, I come in peace. I just want to know what it's like.
Well, here's a tougher one for you, Tejal, and for you, Besha, as well. When this is over and we go back to the business or regularly scheduled programming of writing what we call restaurant criticism, what is going to be the role of restaurant criticism in a post-pandemic world where places are once again open for business and the critic is going out to assay the scene? There's going to be, I imagine, because I can hear the drum beats of it already in our social media and in our comments, there's going to be a drumbeat of boosterism and cheerleading and the like. What's going to be the role of the critic in all of that? And I'll start with you, Tejal.
I was never very good at answering this question, even before the pandemic. It's so hard for me to imagine what the world is going to look like when this is over. I think my job won't be the same as it was, but I don't think I'll be a professional cheerleader either.
Oh, I know that's true.
But yeah, I think the way I think about my work and the way I look at criticism will have to change a little bit. I wish I had a more articulate answer, but it's very hard for me to imagine what things are going to be like. and also what readers will want to know.
Besha, how about you?
I think that I've always viewed the job of critic as, you know, obviously you're a consumer advocate to a certain extent, but really you're an advocate if you're a city critic, especially for your city. What do you want your city to look like? What's important culturally to be supporting and calling out? What is happening in the scene that is maybe, you know, craven and so I don't know that for me those things will change too much. Again, I'm a little bit lucky because I have a national beat, so I don't have as many restaurants that I'm covering that's just like everybody's interested in this. Is it good? Is it bad? But even when I was a city critic, that's really how I looked at my job of what about this city that do we want to support, and what about it do we want to see less of? And I think that will be the same. Like I said, I'm worried that it's going to be the big groups with a ton of money who are just, you know, coming in and are surviving. And I think it will still be valid to say, do we really want that? And is this really worth spending your money here when there are so many great things out there that are struggling? So in that sense, it's not going to change too much for me.
We have about 10 minutes left in this call, and I want to make sure that we aren't just unremittingly dark about things. So in the interest of both food pornography and nostalgia, I'd like to ask you about your final meal that you ate out before the coronavirus, and if it's helpful, I think you can dial it back to a final meal, like not when you were like this is going to change, or the final normal meal that you had in a restaurant before all this happened to us. And if you can describe it with the usual exquisite quality of detail that you bring to your prose, it would make all of us very happy. Pete, you want to start?
You know, I don't know if I actually remember when things were normal, but I do remember when we were in that twilight period where I was starting to think that maybe I shouldn't be there, and I was wondering if my realization that I shouldn't be going out anymore was going to coincide with your realization that I shouldn't be going out anymore, if we were going to have a long discussion about, you know, how long do I keep going out into restaurants when I'm starting to feel like maybe it's not the smartest, safest thing to do. And luckily we both kind of figured it out at the same moment. But there were a few meals when I you know, you could feel that something was coming. You couldn't quite tell what it was going to look like. And we were trying this 50% capacity for, I don't know what, like a minute and a half in New York City. And I remember right before I started staying home completely, I went and ate falafel out in the middle of Brooklyn. And somebody had told me, oh, there's really good falafel at this place. You should check it out. And I went in and I, like, you know, well, it's a kosher restaurant, so it's very easy to wash my hands. And I washed my hands about 3 times, like when I went in, and then again when my food came, and then again when I was clearing my food. And I sat at a counter at the window looking out, and was sort of, you know, maybe 3 feet away from the nearest person, but it wasn't very crowded. But I was just thinking, like, this just can't go on. You know, this can't keep happening.
Well, that wasn't the beautiful memory I was looking for, but
oh wait, I forgot to tell you, the falafel is incredible. It's actually like, it's I guess from your point of view, the point of the story is that the falafel was like some of the best I've ever had. And I'm not like the world's hugest falafel hound, but it was really like sort of sit up and notice falafel with really good warm, you know, pita, like right out of the oven. It was a sort of transcendent food experience in a very weird psychological setting. Does that help?
Tejal, you want? Yeah, it does. You pulled out of the tailspin there and gave us some deliciousness. Tejal, I want to try you.
Okay. Well, my actual last restaurant meal was at Szechuan Impression, where I had the boiled fish, but it wasn't. It wasn't quite normal because the staff was wearing masks and gloves. But the meal before that, where things did still feel normal, I was sitting at the bar at Swan Oyster Depot in San Francisco, and I was alone, and I was at the bar crushed between two very large men on either side of me. And I was eating the crabsanthemum. I don't know if you're familiar with that dish. It's a portmanteau of chrysanthemum and crab. It's just crab legs arranged like a gigantic flower. And it comes with this lemony mustard vinaigrette. And I had that with a beer. And as I had it, I watched someone, actually the son of the owner, hammering crabs because it was Dungeness crab season, and just taking them apart one by one with a mallet. And it was really soothing and beautiful.
Oh, see, that's what I'm talking about. Tejal, yours was where?
San Francisco.
Sorry, Besha, where, I'm sorry, I'm switching over to Besha now. Besha, your last memory of a great restaurant meal before it
my
all
last
changed?
restaurant meal was, as I said before, at Aldila in Brooklyn with a very, very dear friend who lives on the other side of the world. I was in New York for 2 nights, and I was on my way. I was escaping America and on my way back to quarantine. And it was a really beautiful meal because when I lived in Brooklyn 16 years ago now, Aldila was probably the restaurant I went to the most. I used to spend my rent money there. So it was a very nostalgic meal for me. My friend showed up and I said, sorry, we have to order, these dishes that we're getting the tripe, we're getting the gnocchi, we're getting these things that I haven't had in 10 years time because I never have an excuse to go there when I'm in New York. And I just loved that room so much. And it was pure nostalgia meal, comfort food. That brown butter gnocchi, bitter greens is so good still. And it was exactly what I needed. Somebody on Twitter asked the same question. And I said, look, if this was my last meal on earth, I would be cool with it, honestly.
So as we spin up to quarter of the hour here, I'd like to ask you to kind of sum things up by just give me one word that describes your outlook for the restaurant industry right now. And I realize mine would probably be bleak, but perhaps you've got a different view. Tejal, you want to give it a shot?
I think it might be overly optimistic, but let's go with hopeful.
Ah, love it. Mr. Wells?
Well, Darwin comes to mind.
Okay. Okay. How about you, Besha?
Am I allowed to just scream like
Yeah. Yeah.
Ah! I like Tejal's hopeful, but
You're screaming.
Yeah, I'm a little anxious.
So we've got some Darwinian bleakness, we've got some screaming, but underpinning it all, we've got the hope that unites all restaurant critics, I think, because they're the ones who look at any restaurant and think, you know what, that could be pretty good. Let's go check it out. And hopefully we will be able to go check it out in the months and years to come. I want to thank everyone for joining us on today's call. Today's event is part of a daily conversation series with New York Times journalists that takes place at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Tomorrow, which is April 14, you'll hear from Francesca Donner and Alicia Haradasani Gupta on our gender desk. They'll be speaking with author Caroline Criado Perez about corona, gender, and data. To find out more about our full slate of digital events, please visit timesevents.nytimes.com. Thank you to our subscribers. You make our work possible, and we look forward to speaking with you again. Pete, Tejal, Besha, thank you so very much.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you.
Thank you.